Good evening, and thank you for lending us your ears tonight. It's time for Mimi and Pico TV. Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another deep dive. Tonight, we're embarking on really a fascinating journey into the depths of Japanese culture. Now, you might hear that and think, okay, history lesson time, maybe some art. But what we're going to unpack from this incredible stack of source material, it goes far, far deeper. Really, it's something surprisingly practical, intimately connected to the very survival and flourishing of a people. And it even offers potential insights into humanity's future, maybe even like out among the stars. These sources are absolutely brimming with aha moments, and I'm genuinely excited to explore them with you.
That's exactly right. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore these sources that ask some really fundamental questions, big ones. They challenge, the usual ideas about where culture comes from, how it survives over these vast stretches of time, and they make a really compelling case for what might just be Japan's deepest, most enduring natural resource. As you mentioned, we'll be connecting these ancient ideas to modern science, practical logic, and thinking about their relevance for life in challenging environments, both here on Earth and, maybe even in space. We're going to take the core arguments, the surprising connections, the specific examples from these sources, and try to lay them out in a way that's hopefully easy to grasp and genuinely insightful for you.
All right, let's really unpack this then. The sources jump right in with the central idea that culture isn't just a byproduct of a nation, but arguably its greatest natural resource. And they point to Japan specifically, describing it as practically overflowing with content and stories. Why is this cultural resource considered so vital, so much more than just, entertainment or art?
That's a crucial starting point, and the source presents this fascinating perspective on where culture actually comes from. It suggests it arises from kind of a twofold process. First, there's human selection, the deliberate choices people make, what they value, what traditions they keep alive, what stories they tell, what they pass down. That's the conscious part, the active creation and preservation. But secondly, and maybe this is the more profound part in the long run, there's this sort of natural selection for culture itself.
Natural selection for culture. That
Yeah.
sounds interesting.
Exactly. It sounds a bit counterintuitive at first, doesn't it? But think about it. The elements of culture, the practices, the ways of thinking, the stories that have a deep, harmonious, natural fit with the environment, those that adapt well, merge seamlessly with the natural conditions of a place. Those are the ones that prove resilient. They survive over millennia, kind of like a successful species in an ecosystem, because they just work in that context. They're robust. And this is where Japan's unique geography becomes absolutely central to the source's argument. It's described not just as an island nation, but specifically as the world's largest volcanic archipelago.
Wow, the largest. I didn't know that.
Yeah, imagine that chain of islands, constantly in flux, born from volcanic activity. It's an environment that gets frequently and dramatically reset by natural disasters. The sources mention tsunamis, for example, striking with, devastating regularity, potentially every few years or decades in some areas. And that's not even mentioning the earthquakes, the volcanic eruptions. It's definitely not a stable, predictable place. Living in that kind of dynamic, sometimes really harsh environment for thousands and thousands of years, well, it fundamentally shaped the culture, the mindset. The sources highlight how this reality fostered specific ways of seeing and interacting with the world. Concepts like mono no nowhere, that pathos of things, that deep, almost wistful appreciation for the beauty of impermanence.
Right, the idea that everything changes, nothing lasts forever.
Exactly. And the sources argue this wasn't just some kind of abstract philosophy, it was a cultural adaptation, a way to find meaning and beauty in a world where you just couldn't rely on things staying the same. They also mention Mazuro-buri. Now, that's often linked to masculine valor or stoicism, but here the source connects it more to focusing on growth, on resilience, on strength when facing adversity. Again, a direct response to the environment.
Okay, so these weren't just philosophical ideas, they were practical ways of coping and thriving.
Precisely. In this constantly shifting landscape, think about the practical knowledge needed. What kinds of buildings might survive? What wisdom about the tides, the seasons, the land itself was crucial to preserve? And how do you ensure the survival and prosperity of your descendants? That knowledge was paramount, this essential practical wisdom, this embedded know-how. It wasn't initially written down in textbooks or anything. It was woven right into the fabric of cultural practices, embedded in the stories they told, the rituals they performed, the ways of life that had been tested again and again by the nature of the archipelago.
So it's less about just creating fun stories or beautiful art in a vacuum, and more about these cultural things acting as like a deep storage vault for survival knowledge, a kind of sophisticated survival guide.
Exactly, you've got it. And this idea, it opens up one of the most surprising, almost counterintuitive arguments in the source material, which is the profound and often totally overlooked connection between these ancient cultural practices, especially those rooted in Shinto shrines, and, well, science.
Science? Wait, hang on. You mean like empirical observation, data collection, logical analysis, that kind of science?
Yeah.
How on earth do you connect that with ancient shrines and ritual? That feels like a massive leap.
It does feel like a leap initially, doesn't it? I mean, shrines and science labs seem worlds apart. But the sources build a pretty compelling case, and they use a specific example that really helps ground this idea. Jingu-reki. That's who. This is the traditional almanac associated with Ice Grand Shrine, one of Japan's most revered sites.
Jingu-reki, like a calendar.
Well, yeah, but if you just heard the name, you might think, okay, historical calendar, maybe tells you lucky days, something like that. But the source revealed its function was way more sophisticated and deeply tied to practical observational science. The Jingu-reki basically functioned as an incredibly detailed data book. That's the term used. It wasn't just predicting auspicious days. No, it meticulously tracked precise environmental data crucial for life there. We're talking about recording the exact direction the sun rises on specific dates throughout the year, the phases of the moon with remarkable accuracy, and critically, the complex patterns of the tides around the islands, all logged.
Wow. Okay, that's way more than just a calendar.
Right. The source describes this function as essentially being an ancient Earth environmental statistics center. That's IEO. It was a central institutionalized effort to collect, record, and understand the natural world cycles over long, long periods. And this wasn't, secret knowledge kept locked away. The sources highlight that simplified, more accessible versions of this almanac existed. These weren't just for elite scholars or priests. They were practical guides distributed to everyday people. They provided crucial info, like the best timing for planting different crops, all based on that accumulated environmental data. Or, importantly, warnings about when specific pest outbreaks, like the devastating rice borers, might be expected based on seasonal patterns and astronomical observations.
So they were like ancient farming manuals combined with early warning systems and astronomical charts, all based on real data.
Precisely. They were practical tools for living successfully in that specific dynamic environment. And this is where the connection to culture, especially festivals and rituals, IV and ER, becomes really insightful. The source argues that these festivals weren't just acts of religious devotion or cultural celebration in the way we think of them now. They likely served a vital, maybe even primary social function.
A social function.
Yeah. Think of them as highly effective social rituals, designed specifically to communicate this crucial environmental knowledge. The planting times, the harvest readiness, the expected pest cycles, the understanding of seasonal shifts, all that vital stuff. By embedding this information into memorable, often annual events like the Rice Planting Festival or the Harvest Festival, they made sure it wasn't forgotten. It was a super effective way to cement this collective knowledge across the whole population and across generations, often through, engaging multisensory experiences that went way beyond just reading instructions. It became part of the community's rhythm. This accumulated, embedded know-how about living in tune with the environment directly helped populations thrive and increase. The cultural practices around valuing the turn of the seasons, participating in these specific festivals, they weren't random. They had a deeply rational, logical basis tied directly to food security, survival, and prosperity in that environment. It was applied science, just wrapped in ritual and celebration.
Wow, that's actually mind-blowing. So the rituals weren't anti-science or anything. They were ingenious methods for teaching and preserving vital environmental science, making complex data understandable through parties and tradition, like science's performance art.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. The source makes a strong case that ancient people, particularly the Jomon people, who developed these ways of living over 16,000 years, they were fundamentally science people. They weren't ignorant or just superstitious like the stereotype sometimes goes. They actively observed nature, decomposed phenomena, tried to understand how things work. They were really keen naturalists. But their methods for conveying this complex understanding, the timings, the warnings, the intricate connections in nature to the whole community, especially kids who needed to learn fast, those methods were different from ours. They translated, the source uses the word mahjong, or this knowledge, into more accessible, memorable, engaging forms. Rituals, stories, myths, traditions.
Like the stained glass windows in old churches. Telling stories visually.
Exactly like that. The source makes that exact comparison. Stained glass conveyed complex religious ideas to people who couldn't read. Japan, the source contends, has this continuous living stream of cultural events and traditions that function similarly. Think about it from the specific foods eaten at New Year's like Nanakusa-gayu, or Si, or rituals like Kagami Baraki occurring happening all through the year. They're all embedded with layers of practical meaning, passed down through action and participation. And consider the sheer density of these institutions even today. Over 80,000 Shinto shrines. Combine that with Buddhist temples, you're looking at around 150,000 locations across the country.
Whoa, that's way more than schools or anything.
Far more widespread than modern institutions like kindergartens or elementary schools, yeah. For centuries, maybe millennia, these places served as pervasive guides for living successfully in the Japanese archipelago, not just spiritually, but practically. They were centers of local knowledge. The source suggests that the communities or tribes that were most successful at creating and maintaining these pragmatic systems, the data collection, the translation into ritual, the effective sharing of know-how were the ones that really thrived. The ones that survived through countless generations and natural cycles. This wasn't just random chance. It points to a long, continuous process of trial and error. Effective practices, rooted in understanding and responding to the local environment, endured. They became tradition because they worked. It wasn't based purely on abstract concepts or high-minded ideas alone. It was grounded in practical meaning and evidence that helped people survive locally. And this whole line of thinking, it raises a really important question, One, the source really pushes us to consider. When modern people, often focused almost exclusively on the material world, the stuff we can easily measure with our current science, when we dismiss these ancient traditions as unscientific, superstition, or just absurd, are we maybe being a bit intellectually arrogant? Are we overlooking a deep layer of accumulated wisdom of practical science just because it's packaged differently than we expect?
That definitely puts a whole new spin on things. It makes you reconsider what science even means. It sounds like ancient people had this incredibly sophisticated, practical relationship with nature, and their culture was the framework for it. Does the source explore that connection even further?
Oh yes, it dives quite deep into that. Particularly the concept of having profound respect or awe for nature and for forces or things larger than oneself. The term used is die. The source makes a compelling argument, drawing examples like desert tribes who show immense respect for their harsh environment. It suggests that societies cultivating this awe had a higher survival rate, especially in unpredictable places.
Why would that be? How does awe help survival?
Well, think about it. Respecting nature makes you inherently more cautious, more attuned to subtle changes, more aware of potential dangers, storms, droughts, whatever the local risks are. It leads to more careful behavior. Plus, having a common object of reverence, something bigger than any single individual ego, tends to foster unity within the group. It creates a shared humility, a common purpose. This can prevent internal conflicts and lead to better cooperation compared to groups where everyone thinks they're the absolute top dog, leading to power struggles. The source also offers this really intriguing idea about human perception. It suggests we're like biological receivers, equipped with senses that can pick up subtle cues from the environment, frequencies maybe, that our conscious eyes and ears don't fully register in detail. Instead, we might perceive these cues as a general presence or signs. The word used is lit.
Like that feeling you get sometimes, like something's about to happen or someone's nearby.
Exactly that feeling, sensing an approaching storm before you see the clouds, or that prickling awareness of an animal in the woods. The source speculates that living in Japan's dynamic environment, needing constant vigilance to these subtle changes for, 16,000 years since the Jomon period, maybe that honed this intuitive sensing ability to a remarkable degree in the people there. And here's another fascinating point the source uses to illustrate this difference in perception: how nature sounds are heard. In many Western contexts, insect sounds, like that intense buzz of cicadas in summer, might just be classified as bugs or dismissed as background noise, something to filter out.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Sometimes it's just loud.
Right. But in Japan, these sounds are often deeply integrated into the cultural consciousness. They're heard as voices of living things, full of meaning, resonance. They become subjects of classical poetry in collections like the Manyoshu or the Kokin Wakashu. It reflects that whole aesthetic concept of kachofugetsu, appreciating nature's beauty through flowers, birds, wind, the moon. There's this deep sense of resonance, or a feeling of living with nature, not just in it. This deep connection also showed up as a kind of ingrained biological clock, or nature clock, she or she. Before mechanical clocks were common, people tracked the seasons by observing specific indicator species. It wasn't just dates on a calendar. Spring arrived with certain flowers blooming and the distinct song of the bush warbler, the ba. Summer's peak was marked by the call of the hokotojisu. These living markers shaped daily life, farming cycles, their sense of time itself, and it permeated their art and poetry. Time felt interwoven with the living world.
Wow, their calendar wasn't just numbers, it was literally written in the blooming flowers and bird songs around them. That's beautiful.
It's a very integrated way of experiencing time, isn't it? And speaking of things written and structured, the source draws this really fascinating contrast between Western and Japanese cultural ideas about equality. In the West, a cornerstone is often equality before the law, right? Formalized in documents like the Magna Carta, legal rights, frameworks. The source suggests Japan had a different, maybe equally fundamental concept: equality before poetry or song.
Equality before poetry, what does that mean?
It points to classical poetry collections, like the Kokin Wakashu, this day. In these anthologies, if a poem was genuinely powerful, resonant, beautiful, if it moved people, it was included, regardless of who wrote it. Many famous poems are attributed to Yomibito Shirazu, that means author unknown. This highlights that the impact and the quality of the expression were valued above the social standing of the person who created it. The source contrasts this with historical situations in other cultures where the voices of certain groups, maybe slaves or lower classes, were often systematically excluded from art or literature, no matter how talented they were.
So the poem itself, the art, was the important thing, not the status of the artist.
Exactly. It suggests a cultural foundation where the intrinsic value, the resonance of an idea or creation, was the ultimate standard, elevated above social hierarchy. Culture itself, in that sense, was the higher entity, the plane where everyone could potentially meet as equals based on the merit of their expression. This deep value for cultural resonance is a key part of that resource we talked about. And this sensitivity to nature, to atmosphere, to subtle cues, it also ties directly into a well-known modern concept in Japanese society: reading the air.
Ah, yes, reading the air. I've heard of that.
It's incredibly valuable for sensing those physical environmental changes we discussed or potential dangers. But the source notes it's a double-edged sword. That same heightened sensitivity can manifest socially, leading to experiencing significant social pressure. It's like having a finely tuned sensor that picks up everything: physical signals, social signals, sometimes really intensely.
Okay, that makes total sense. Being hyper-aware of everything, nature, other people's feelings, social dynamics, wow, that must create a lot of pressure. Does the source suggest how Japanese society traditionally dealt with that? Like, how did they release that pressure valve?
Yes, absolutely. This is another really key insight from the source material. It proposes that Japanese society developed these subtle, sometimes kind of counterintuitive, but really effective decompression devices, or chambers. The terms used are chunu, or drum edger. They're specifically designed to release this built-up social and environmental pressure. And as we touched on earlier, the most prominent example given is festivals.
Festivals as decompression chambers, how does that work?
To understand it, the source brings in the concept of hair and K. K is the ordinary, everyday state of life. Routine, social norms, strict roles, the place where that social pressure often builds up. Hair, on the other hand, is the extraordinary, the sacred, the festive state. Festivals provide a designated time and space, a hair time, where the usual rules of K are temporarily suspended. People aren't just allowed, they're often encouraged to deviate from normal behavior.
Deviate how?
Well, the source describes people becoming wild, boisterous in public ways they'd never normally act, dressing up in elaborate or unusual costumes, even appearing semi-naked in traditional festival parades. Wearing masks, like the comical Hiratoko mask, or costumes allows for a temporary identity shift, a sense of becoming someone or something else. Sometimes it's described with the word hioi, like a temporary, playful possession. This temporary shedding of the everyday self, inhabiting a different persona. The source argues this is a powerful way to release inhibitions and let go of the pressure built up during the key state. And the source gives this really vivid modern example. Think about a major financial district like Otemaki or Marunouchi in Tokyo. All week, people are in extreme key mode, right? Strict professional codes, suits, formal behavior. But then comes time for a big local festival like the Kanda Myojin Festival, Ati, and those exact same individuals might suddenly be seen participating enthusiastically in a loud, energetic, maybe even semi-naked parade right through those same streets.
Whoa, the same people. That's quite a switch.
It really is. And the source argues this clearly demonstrates a deeply ingrained cultural ability to switch between different situational drawers. You can follow one set of rules strictly in one context, then seamlessly shift to a completely different mode in another. This capacity allows for a complex, multi-layered cultural identity where seemingly contradictory behaviors can coexist just fine. The source also links this adaptability back to those constant natural changes in Japan. The frequent need to respond to environmental shifts, seasons, disasters seems to foster an innate ability to sense change and to transform or adapt quickly. This environmental dynamism might make people less culturally dull or resistant to change compared to cultures from more stable environments.
So the environment itself encourages flexibility.
It seems to play a big role. And connecting this ancient idea of temporary identity shifts and parallel worlds to modern culture, the source points to things like cosplay, using avatars online, virtual reality, VR, and the whole world of otaku culture. These are presented as contemporary examples of that ancient hayoi or twinning ability, the human desire and capacity to inhabit non-real identities or explore alternative worlds alongside physical reality. It's a modern form of decompression and expression. And finally, on this point, the source touches on a very relevant modern challenge, the rise of mental health issues like depression in Japanese society. It speculates that maybe trying to force these deeply ingrained Eastern values, that sensitivity, that reading the air into a purely westernized social or work framework can cause real conflict and distress. It uses the phrase getting burned, like trying to run the wrong current through a wire, because of the fundamental nature, hide, the person's ingrained cultural operating system, might be different.
That's a really powerful point. So forcing one cultural model onto another might actually cause harm.
That's the suggestion. It implies that Japan might need to develop its own unique approach, maybe a third place, or its own framework for social well-being and mental health, one that acknowledges and integrates these unique cultural traits, rather than just trying to copy Western models that might not fully fit.
Okay, so this ancient wisdom, this unique cultural makeup forged by geography and tradition, it's not just history. It's potentially deeply relevant to modern life, mental health, even things like cosplay.
Yeah.
How does the source connect all this to Japan's place in the world today and maybe its future role?
That's exactly the next step the source takes. It argues that this unique blend, the ancient and modern coexisting, positions Japan significantly on the international stage, and even, looking towards future human ventures like space exploration. Think about Japan's global position. It's highly developed, technologically advanced, deeply integrated into the global economy. Standard stuff for a G7 nation. But it's also managed to keep alive many deep, traditional, spiritual, even animistic values and practices that are, frankly, less prevalent or visible in many other developed nations. This duality is pretty rare.
Right, you don't often see ancient shrines right next to skyscrapers in the same way.
Exactly. And the source suggests this unique position makes Japan well-suited to act as a kind of coordinator, a harmonizer, or a bridge. The terms used are hu or hu, especially in a world that feels increasingly divided. Because of its complex history and relationships, the strong alliance with the U.S., the geographical proximity and deep cultural ties, like shared written characters, with East Asian neighbors like China and Korea, Japan is arguably in a unique spot to understand and navigate different global perspectives. It can kind of speak the language of multiple sides, potentially helping find common ground.
So like a cultural diplomat, almost.
In a way, yes. But the source suggests this capacity for mediation isn't just about formal diplomacy. It's rooted deeper in the culture's emphasis on harmony, relationship, context. There's this humorous but insightful point made about the concept of a banquet minister.
A banquet minister? Seriously?
Yeah. Imagine, it suggests, that solving complex global problems might sometimes happen more effectively, not in stiff, formal meetings, but through informal gatherings, sharing meals, drinks, maybe even karaoke. It highlights the power of human connection, empathy, mutual understanding, fostered through shared cultural activities, a way to break down barriers that formal talks sometimes reinforce. This ties back to that idea of culture, especially positive, connecting ideas being the most infectious idea humans have. Spreading positive, harmonizing ideas and cultural experiences from Japan ideas rooted in empathy, connection, resilience could create a new kind of global gravity, pulling people together instead of pushing them apart. This potential role as a cultural and diplomatic harmonizer is presented as a key future possibility for Japan. And then the source makes this fascinating leap to the future, specifically to humans living in space.
Okay, how does ancient Japanese culture connect to space travel?
It notes that the conditions of living in space, think about it, extreme isolation, very limited resources, a challenging, potentially hostile environment needing intense cooperation. These conditions might actually bear surprising similarities to the historical experience of living on those resource-limited, disaster-prone Japanese islands for millennia. Japan's long history of adapting to scarcity and unpredictability, its cultural focus on resilience, community, sustainability, this could be incredibly relevant off-world.
Huh. I never thought of it like that. Space is an extreme island.
Kind of, yeah. And think about being far from Earth for long periods. Familiar reference points vanish. Where is Mecca for prayer? How do you mark sacred time? How do you maintain spiritual or psychological stability, that spiritual gravity, when you're literally unmoored from your home planet? The source suggests Japan's cultural perspective, where nature itself, the environment, can be seen as divine or sacred, where the sun or moon are deities, already offers a framework. It argues Japan has a kind of cultural preparedness to handle different layers of reality, including a spiritual connection to the immediate environment, without needing to invent entirely new cosmologies just for space. There are anecdotes mentioned about astronauts experiencing unexpected boredom or existential unease despite packed technical schedules. It highlights that even with amazing tech, there's a fundamental human need for meaning, connection, dealing with that spiritual gap and isolation. So the source speculates that play, that inherent human drive for creative, non-utilitarian activity, might become a huge industry in space. And maybe space will need its own rituals, its own ceremonies, its own space festivals to provide communal meaning and connection. Japan's cultural history, full of rituals connecting people to environment and community, could offer a blueprint.
Wow. So the wisdom developed over thousands of years, adapting to islands, might actually provide blueprints for human well-being among the stars. That is genuinely mind-blowing.
It's a pretty wild thought, isn't it? And much of this potential, the source argues strongly, lies in Japan rediscovering and fully appreciating its own deep history and values, many of which have maybe been undervalued or overshadowed by centuries of looking primarily westward. Let's revisit that ancient Japanese view of the universe and nature one more time. The sheer power, the vastness, the unpredictability, volcanoes, earthquakes, typhoons, it naturally fostered that deep awe. They saw nature as having two fundamental faces, often personified. The nurturing side, Nigimitama, providing bounty fish, plants, resources, and the destructive side, Aramitama, shares bringing storms, earthquakes, chaos. Because humans couldn't control or fully grasp these huge forces, they were seen as transcendent, as kami, part of the divine realm. But, and this is absolutely key, even without our modern scientific framework and words, the source insists that people, especially the Jomon, practiced a fundamental form of scientific inquiry. Observation, comparison, analysis. They meticulously watched the moon's phases night after night, compared them to the tides along the coast. And through that process, gradually figured out the connection, the gravitational pull. They observed animal migrations, plant cycles, weather patterns, rigorously.
So they were doing science, just maybe didn't call it that.
Exactly. This rigorous process of observation, comparison, analysis, applied over centuries, that is science, which is why the source calls the Jomon people science people, siu. And their rituals, their festivals, their traditions weren't just random superstitions. As we discussed, they were logical, rational, effective ways to spread that hard-won knowledge and ensure collective survival. The source argues that modern society, by often dismissing these deep traditions and intuitive ways of knowing as unscientific or backward, we're effectively throwing away accumulated bundles of logic. The millennia of refined understanding about living in harmony with a place and with each other, we're discarding valuable data just because the packaging is ancient.
Like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, basically.
Pretty much. And this presents a huge opportunity, especially now in the current global context. The source places it around 2025. It's a moment, it suggests, where Japan has a real chance to highlight and share its own deep-grounded wisdom, rather than always feeling it needs to imitate or validate itself through a Western lens. The source even provocatively suggests that in our relentless search for brand new, untested knowledge and tech solutions, modern society might just be reinventing the wheel. We might be arriving at conclusions the Jomon people, in their own way, already grasped thousands of years ago. Maybe the answers we're looking for are already here, woven into our traditions, but we're just looking in the wrong places. Mention is made, too, of the profound Buddhist concept Sansen Samoku Shitsuputsu, Tutsu. The idea that mountains, rivers, plants, trees all possess Buddha nature, or a soul.
Everything has a soul.
Essentially, yes. It reflects this radical sense of equality and interconnectedness of all life, not just human life. And this isn't just philosophy, it's a way of seeing the world woven deeply into Japanese culture, influencing art, environmental views, everything. So the source asks, why is modern society struggling with feelings of fragmentation, lack of meaning, disconnection? It suggests part of the reason is we've become overly focused on what can be neatly explained logically, measured, put into words, and we dismiss or devalue anything that doesn't fit that rigid box. Yet, the source argues, many people have an intuitive knowing, a gut feeling about what's right or true, even if they can't articulate it with perfect linear logic. The hints, it says, are right at our feet, in our connection to nature, in our traditions, in our own innate senses. We need to move beyond just rigid reductionist logic and learn to re-embrace intuition, nonverbal cues, maybe even the power of kododama, that ancient belief in the power of words themselves to shape reality.
So trusting intuition more, looking beyond just logic.
And looking at how things connect. The source draws this powerful contrast between a Western reductionist approach, trying to understand something by breaking it down into smaller, isolated parts, like peeling an onion to find the core, and a more Japanese or Buddhist perspective. In this view, the bubble surface, the observable reality, the interactions, the relationships, is the essence. Meaning isn't found by isolating parts, but in the connections, or ju, and the mutual interactions between them. From this viewpoint, maybe existence is less about being a fixed, isolated self and more about being like a pipe, a conduit through which events, relationships, consciousness flows. Harmony and connection become paramount because the meaning lives in the space between.
That's a very different way of thinking about, well, everything.
It is. And it suggests that consciousness and intention aren't passive. They're key forces that can drive positive change. So, creating compelling, overarching societal narratives, shared stories about our collective future, humanity's role, the story of Earth becomes crucial. These narratives provide meaning and gravity, anchoring people's consciousness, giving them a sense of purpose. Being part of a larger story, the source feels, is a source of happiness often missing today.
Wow. Okay. So this vast cultural richness, this deep understanding, it's not just history. It's like this hidden treasure, a massive oil field right under our feet, waiting to be discovered and used. How does the source propose we actually dig up this resource and make it valuable today?
That's exactly the transition the source makes, returning to that culture as oil analogy. It is seen as a vast, largely untapped resource, and the source outlines a pretty clear two-step process for accessing and using it to create value. Step 1, finding the resource. This is fundamentally about imagination. It's the capacity to see potential, envision possibilities, make new connections, find the unique and valuable in what seems ordinary. Imagination is the exploration. Step 2, processing and exporting it. This is about creativity and expression. Imagination alone, powerful as it is just potential energy. It only becomes valuable capital, a tangible asset, when it's shaped, processed, and expressed in a way others can share and understand. Creativity is the engine that turns raw imagination into usable, exportable value. The source envisions an entire imagination economy built on this.
An imagination economy. Okay, can you give an example of how that works? Processing imagination.
Yeah, the source provides a really specific, concrete example, Japanese versus Western fish processing. In many Western approaches, processing fish might focus on, say, efficiency cleaning, filleting, maybe freezing quickly. But Japanese techniques like saku, chun, the whole art of preparing fish often includes methods like shimaru. Now, shimaru isn't just killing the fish. It's a precise method, often involving immediate bleeding. And the source explains the science. This specific technique, seemingly small, actually enhances the fish's flavor significantly by producing more delicious amino acids, like glutamate, as the fish dies.
Really? Just how you kill it changes the taste that much?
According to the source, yes. This unique, culturally embedded know-how developed over centuries of interacting with the sea. That's a valuable cultural asset, mostly unknown in the West. So exporting this isn't just about selling more fish, it's about conveying the value behind the technique. It means explaining the science, why shimaru makes it taste better, the amino acids. It involves conveying the aesthetic, the beauty of expertly prepared fish. It involves sharing the cultural context, the deep respect for the ingredient. Doing that requires analysis, understanding why it works. Translation, making the concept understandable, not just the word. And effective communication. This process highlights the crucial importance of what the source calls relativization, chu emery, actively comparing your own culture, your practices, your ways of seeing to others. That comparison helps you see what's truly unique and valuable about your own context, things you might overlook because you're used to them. The source suggests creating a chaos map of global culture. Understanding diverse values worldwide helps identify where your unique assets fit, where they're rare, where opportunities lie.
Okay, so you find the unique oil through imagination and comparison. Then what?
Then that discovered oil, the unique imagination. The know-how needs processing into shareable formats. Stories, music, art, films, techniques, products, services, experiences, whatever fits. And then it needs effective export, sharing it with the world. This whole process is what constitutes the creative industry. The source even envisions a future where individuals gain more freedom by trading their personal regional assets. Think unique skills, knowledge, stories tied to their local area or family history, or their intellectual property on digital platforms. This could allow a circulation of diverse, unique value, maybe freeing people from reliance on more rigid, traditional economic structures. Which brings us back to that powerful idea. The source argues everyone is, in a sense, an oil-producing country, or a power generator with infinite potential inside. But often we don't realize it because we're conditioned to focus only on external, quantifiable values, grades, salaries, status, things easily measured and compared. We overlook the unique, immeasurable value within us and our culture.
So the biggest barrier isn't actually finding this cultural oil. It's more like realizing it's already inside us, woven into our everyday lives, our history. We just don't see it.
Precisely. And the main psychological barrier stopping us from seeing this inherent value is something the source calls junka, habituation.
Junka, habituation, getting used to things.
Exactly. Our brains are efficiency machines. They learn to filter out constant familiar stuff, which is great for focus, but it also makes the unique things right in front of us, our local culture, our skills, the beauty around us seem totally ordinary, invisible. So discovering new value in our culture or ourselves is fundamentally a fight against junka, a fight against that tendency for the familiar to fade into the background.
Okay, so how do we fight junka? How do we keep seeing things fresh?
The source offers 3 specific methods to help overcome it, to keep our brains fresh, more able to notice the unique stuff. First, regularly meet and really talk with people from different cultures. Their baseline of normal is different, so they'll immediately notice things about your culture you're completely blind to. They act like external sensors for your own uniqueness. Second, talk to people from different generations. Different age groups have lived through different times, different tech, different norms. Their perspectives will highlight things you miss because of your own generational bubble. An elder might cherish something a younger person ignores, or vice versa. Third, engage in project-based strategic analysis, bow and arrow. This basically means deliberately putting yourself into new contexts or working towards specific, challenging goals with others. It forces you to look at familiar resources, problems, ideas in totally new ways, breaks you out of routine thinking, and reveals overlooked value.
So different cultures, different generations, different projects, like forcing a change of perspective.
Exactly. These methods act as a habituation defense, consciously pushing you to see the unique contours of your own culture, your environment, even yourself, by deliberately stepping out of the comfort zone, travel, even short local trips with fresh eyes, experiencing different situations, even overcoming hardship. These things can massively increase your appreciation for what you have and what's unique, simply because they provide contrast. And regarding processing and exporting this creativity, the source emphasizes that this resource is infinite, unlike physical oil, but it needs conscious shaping, thinking about the audience. A key concept here is yohaku, space out, in creative works.
Leaving things out intentionally.
Exactly. Intentionally leaving things unsaid, unexplained, open-ended. It's not laziness, it's a technique. It allows the audience to step into the work, engage their own imagination, interpret, find their own meaning. The source calls it user-generated yohaku. That's where the play lies for the audience. That delightful uncertainty, that personal connection that makes art really resonate. The source also notes this fascinating shift in what's being valued creatively, a move away from prioritizing just technical resolution, like needing the absolute highest 4K or 6K video quality, towards valuing the depth of narrative, the quality of the story, the emotional or intellectual connection. Creativity itself is evolving towards meaning over mere technical fidelity.
Interesting. So story is becoming more important than pixels.
It seems that way. And there's even speculation in the source about AI's potential role here. Could AI help generate creative slippage, unexpected combinations, deviations, surprising associations that spark new ideas? Could it even assist in expressing complex, intuitive concepts like wabi-sabi, that appreciation of imperfect beauty, or that sense of yuhaku? The source suggests AI might act as a navigation tool, a framework or guide helping human creators explore possibilities rather than replacing them entirely. But to bring it back to the main point, Japan's cultural resource, these deep historical layers, unique perspectives, accumulated know-how, the spiritual layer, the source argues it's perfectly positioned to meet the current global need for meaning, connection, new ways of seeing, especially as we face complex futures like heading into space.
It really does feel like any feelings of stagnation or being stuck personally or culturally, maybe that's just a symptom of this junka, this habituation, and maybe being trapped in a limited way of thinking.
The source suggests exactly that. That feeling of stagnation, being blocked, can be compared to mountain sickness, a feeling of distress caused by excessive social pressure and, as we discussed, junka. And the suggested solution, much like dealing with altitude sickness, is conscious decompression. Deliberately changing your environment, your perspective, your mindset, seeking situations with less pressure. The source emphasizes the maze isn't physical, it's conceptual, built by our habits, perspectives, the pressure we feel.
So changing your thinking can literally break you out of feeling stuck.
That's the idea. And given that Japanese cultural tendency towards reading the air, potentially experiencing high social pressure, having these decompression methods, traditional festivals, modern expression, whatever works, is argued to be particularly vital for well-being. The source goes on to mention specific potential future collaborations, areas of exploration that could help surface and use this hidden wisdom. One key area: engaging with people who maintain deep connections to traditional ways of life. This includes Shinto priests, Buddhist monks, or Chip the Tendai sect is mentioned, maybe for their historical ties to nature and esoteric knowledge, or even individuals pursuing Jomon-like lifestyles today. These people often hold very different perspectives on time, the universe, sensing the world, compared to those immersed in purely modern life. Their intuitive understanding could be invaluable. Another vital perspective: collaborating with foreign Japanologists, scholars, writers, artists studying Japan from the outside.
Why foreigners specifically?
Because they lack the native junka. They often immediately see and highlight unique aspects of Japanese culture that locals might completely overlook because they're too used to them. The source mentions Lafcadio Hearn, Wayu, that foreign writer who integrated into Japan and wrote eloquently about cultural nuances his Japanese contemporaries perhaps didn't see as clearly. Engaging these external perspectives is a powerful junka defense. The source also notes that the current time, again, context around 2025, seems particularly conducive to sharing these kinds of ideas. Society might be more open to questioning convention, exploring alternatives than in the past. Platforms like YouTube are mentioned as useful tools, bypassing some gatekeepers and social pressure of traditional media, allowing direct sharing.
Okay, so talking to traditional practitioners and foreign experts, what else for the future?
Looking further ahead, the source suggests we might need entirely new academic fields. Maybe narrative creation studies, a key. Focused on understanding how to build and leverage compelling stories for meaning and energy. It envisions a future where traditional local sites, shrines, temples, historic places, and their local experts become new kinds of schools, centers for polishing and sharing these deep cultural assets, living classrooms for that imagination economy. It even imagines Japan becoming like a one-piece country, referencing the treasure hunt manga.
Like a treasure hunt across Japan.
Yeah, where people, Japanese and foreign, explore regions like a treasure hunt, discovering unique local stories, cultural assets, local value, fostering a non-conflictual peace economy driven by shared discovery, culture as the ultimate security, building bridges, and stories themselves, whether anime, manga, folklore, new narratives, are seen as incredibly powerful. They can act like time machines or modern fables, teaching younger generations subtle lessons about constructive behavior versus what's not cool, embedding positive norms through narrative, not just rules. The source concludes with this really powerful reflection. Humanity has developed astonishing scientific power, reshaping the material world, yet we've largely left our spiritual, cultural, soft power underdeveloped. untapped. We possess immense internal potential, like Arab oil kings, sitting on infinite reserves within ourselves and our cultures. But we're often unaware, focused only on limited external measures.
Like, we don't know how rich we actually are culturally.
Exactly. It even proposes tangible new roles to reflect this shift. Chief storytelling officers, CSO in companies finding and articulating the narrative energy and purpose, and ministers of story in government articulating the shared narratives that give a nation direction and meaning. Recognizing the impact of these roles is key. Digital twins, VR, pun are mentioned not just as tech, but as modern platforms expanding on ancient human needs, exploration, identity play, decompression. Much like ancient masks, no theater puppet shows were early forms of avatarization in VR. Technology evolves, but the core human need for story, connection, exploring identity, that remains constant.
That was an absolutely incredible deep dive. It's completely transformed how I think about Japanese culture, its history, and maybe even our own potential. Seriously.
It really does challenge us to look beyond the surface, doesn't it? The source material makes such a compelling case that the most valuable resources aren't always the obvious ones, not the ones easily measured. It urges us to look closer, to dig deeper, to see the logic, the wisdom, the incredible potential hidden in plain sight in our traditions, our environment, and maybe most importantly, within ourselves.
Yeah, and that maybe the answers to many of our biggest modern problems, maybe even future challenges like living in space.
Yeah.
They aren't some far-off invention. They might already be here, just waiting to be rediscovered, understood, appreciated. It genuinely makes you want to go look for those cultural oil fields.
Indeed. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep connecting those dots, both within yourself and with this incredible, multi-layered world all around you.
See you next time on Mimi and Pico TV.